So it's a play of all sorts of sort of subtle contradictions, and it really talks to the relationship of the masculine and feminine energies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kabbalah and how it presents that to us. So the men within the play, are wanting to open up this academy in order to pursue secret, arcane knowledge. And we talked in the last one a little bit about the mystery schools and the whole process of initiation and that learning that knowledge and that wisdom. And yet they wanted to exclude women, all women, and not just from their academy, but from the court as well. It's as if they couldn't sort of take the temptation, as it were. So they really sort of totally misunderstand or miss one of the greatest wisdom teachings that there is, and that's the wisdom of the divine feminine, and women's wisdom. And anything that doesn't put the feminine on an equal footing with the masculine, how that leads to disharmony. It's about the matching of the two that brings the harmony. But fortunately we can see from the way that Shakespeare writes, not just in this play but in other plays, that actually he's got it and he's pointing it out. Because many of his women's roles actually, he's showing us that the women are almost the wisdom bearers, as it were. And indeed, he very often, and it's one of the ways that wisdom teachings often work, he very often turns the belief that men are superior to women on its head. And it's one of the ways that the wisdom teachings often make people sit up and take notice, is by sort of turning something around. So, I really don't have to tell you much about this. Most of us, I'm sure, are aware of it. Within each of us there sits a masculine and a feminine. It really isn't news. And we can, all of us, kind of understand the different kind of flow, the way the energies flow. One's much more direct, one's more flowing, and so on and so forth. The way we talk about the masculine and feminine are really very, very difficult, and it really speaks to spiritual and psychological presences that really sit within each of us. The masculine and the feminine sits within each of us, to some degree or other. And it's really, they're archetypal forces that all of us recognise, and our myths and our fairy stories speak to this time and time again. Indeed, all of the gods and the goddesses from classical mythology really represent different facets of either the feminine energy or the masculine energy. So we're talking about polarities, and within the wisdom teachings, it's always pointing out polarities and urging us to actually find the balance point, the harmony, the middle way, if you will, to bring those into some kind of balance. And polarity in all its many aspects is really seen as being an expression of the Creator, because everything has come from the Creator. So he's basically, and we're going to talk about how the Kabbalah looks at this, how the Creator has actually created polarity in order to actually better understand himself and to gain knowledge. The wisdom teachings speak in symbols, and this is a very classic way of portraying the masculine and the feminine. We've got the upward pointing masculine triangle and the downward pointing female one that come together. They come together in harmony to form the six-pointed star. And that turns up again and again and again. So male and female, he created them both. This isn't only in the Bible, it forms a part of the Kabbalistic teachings as well. And it's often taken to mean that God is essentially a hermaphrodite. He's both masculine and feminine. Now, whether you take that in the sexual sense or not is really up to you. Spiritually, I don't think it comes into it at all. But basically, God contains both the male and the female, rather than, sort of separately, there being a male God and a female God. So if humans exist in God's image, basically the argument goes, then both men and women reflect the divine essence of the Creator, who contains both qualities. And it kind of is given away time and time again if you go back to the original Bible sort of scripture, as it were, in the Hebrew, because a lot of the words used actually have their roots in the female body. They're what are called goddess terms in the original. And Hebrew was a masculine and feminine language, and there are a lot of feminine words are used to describe God. For example, the biblical word for mercy, or merciful, derives from womb. And Shaddai, which means almighty, comes from a word that means breasts. And talking to Pete the other day, he pointed out to me that Jehovah actually is a feminine form of God. So there's all sorts of hints in the original teachings that we miss really in our language and the way it's translated. So within the Kabbalah, we have the understanding of this masculine and feminine current, and it's very often, the masculine is very often portrayed as being a solar energy, a sun energy, and the feminine as a lunar energy, a moon energy. And there we have, in the middle, we have the middle pillar, which is the harmony of the two coming together in balance, she says. So let's look at the Kabbalah, at the Tree of Life a little bit more. This is a very sort of simplistic drawing of it, which really clearly shows how the middle pillar forms the harmony between the two. And there it is in all of its glory. And again, we've got the masculine pillar, the right-hand pillar, which is the pillar of wisdom, or force it's sometimes called. And we've got the left-hand pillar, the moon pillar, the feminine pillar of intelligence or form, with the middle pillar down the middle there, running between the two. And really the work of the tree is to bring these two together in harmony, to bring both sides of the tree together in harmony. And from the Peshat, which is, I don't know if I've said that right, hopefully, it's the literal interpretation of the biblical accounts. In the account of creation, we learn that God must leave his parents, i.e. man must leave his parents, i.e. God, and he must cleave to his wife so they become one flesh. And there is a reading of the pillar that basically sort of says in its, you've got man and woman, and they come together at the bottom of the tree. They meet at the bottom of the tree in harmony. That's one of the readings of it. There are many, many ways to read and many, many levels to read the Tree of Life on. There's no single interpretation to it. So, the perfect being contains all qualities, male and female, but it couldn't know itself fully. This is what the Zohar tells us, the basic Kabbalistic teachings. It existed alone, it was perfect in itself, but it was unable to discover new things about itself. And in order to do that, it needed basically to split itself into two parts. So all of creation really came from this desire of God to know God. So each part is a whole, it's complete in itself, but a complement to the other. Complementary parts, and the universe really exists because of this desire for God to know himself. And the Tree of Life basically reflects the emergence. If we look at the tree here, it really reflects the emergence of God coming into creation, and by the time we hit the bottom of the Tree of Life, God has effectively, the impulse is grounded in material reality, as it were. So, the making of Adam and Eve, they were made in God's image, basically, to reflect this split in the divine. The masculine impulse and the feminine impulse. And humans are tasked with taking an active role in harmonising and restoring these separated aspects of God. That's what we're meant to be doing. That's the work. So there's a very deep lesson here, actually, and that is that all nature, it's not just man and women, but all nature actually has come from God and is an expression of God. And Francis Bacon, the Tudor philosopher, he tells us, look to the book of nature if we wish to know God. And because we find this divine essence in everything. And indeed, he was called, for those of you who don't know, he was called the father of modern science. And from where he stood, the original purpose of science was to better know and understand the divine. The more you understood nature, the more you understood the nature of divinity. Now, in the story of creation, we don't just have a creator and we don't just have Adam and Eve, we also have a snake. And again, the ancient, the wisdom teachings talk to us in symbolism at all sorts of levels. So if we can gain some quite deep insight in understanding really what the snake symbolises. So here we see it as part of the sort of magical staff, the healing staff of Hermes, the caduceus, which has got two snakes entwined up it, representing the Kundalini energy, which basically twine up the staff or the spine of man, working up through the chakras. The life force was pictured as being nestled at the base of the spine, and it would split into two currents, the Ida and Pingala, and they would weave its way up the spine of man, going through the chakras to meet at the third eye in illumination. So that's one of the sort of symbolisms of the snake, but it also talks to us of birth and renewal in the way that the snake sheds its skin, which is really encouraging us or telling us to shed old, outdated beliefs and habits and to really move on to a higher expression of ourselves. And the ability to do this is called wisdom. And some say that that is why the snake is also associated with the feminine. So the snake has a lot of symbolism, but from a purely Christian point of view is attributed to the devil, but there's a lot more going on that sits behind that, basically. And there is a slightly different version of the story that comes out of the Kabbalah. It tells a slightly different version, which I think is quite interesting. The differences are quite interesting to the biblical version that we all know. So we have the scene by the tree of knowledge, and it went something like this. The snake says to Eve, "Did God really tell you not to eat from any of the trees?" And Eve says, "Oh no, we can eat from all of them, it's absolutely fine. We're just not allowed to eat from this one, because if we touch this one, we're going to die." And the serpent knows this isn't true, so he sees his chance. He's a sly serpent, he sees his chance, and he bumps Eve. So she goes into the tree of knowledge. And he says to her, "See, you haven't died, it's not true. You've been told a story." And the rabbis here make an interesting point. It's not just that Adam exaggerated to Eve, because Adam said to Eve, he didn't pass on the message from God properly. God said to him, "You must not eat from this tree." And he says to Eve, "You mustn't even touch the tree." So Adam passes on poor information, but the rabbis also said that God actually is in the frame for this as well, because he shouldn't have used Adam as a middleman, he should have told Eve himself directly. So there's quite an interesting point there about the way that plays out. But if we look more closely at the symbolism of what we're seeing here, the serpent represents the life force in man. It's the life force demanding expression within man. And the tree of knowledge could just as easily be called the tree of consciousness, because that's what it bestows on Adam and Eve, awareness. So the serpent really is freeing Adam and Eve into taking their first steps into developing consciousness. It is representing the Kundalini, this Kundalini energy, the life energy of the awakened spirit body that is being offered the power of knowledge, of gnosis. And don't forget that everything in the Garden of Eden, absolutely everything, came from the Creator. Adam, Eve, and the snake. So they all have their parts to play in this. So carrying on with the story, Eve eats from the apple and nothing happens. And so she takes it to Adam and says, "I touched the tree, nothing happened, I've eaten from it, I'm absolutely fine." And she hands the apple to Adam, and he eats of it, and this is where we have the need for balance again, male and female. And as soon as he eats from it, their eyes are opened. And what do they see? They see they're naked. So what does that mean? Well, the Hebrew word for knowledge is darth. And this is the hidden Sephiroth that sits within the tree of life. It sits hidden within the void, knowledge. So this is the knowledge of self-consciousness. It's the knowledge of shame. And this is really the fall of man. It's the loss of the true spirit self. The first steps onto the road to real consciousness. So within that they lose the harmony really of who they are to this false knowledge. Because knowledge without wisdom or without understanding, and Peter's talked about that a bit earlier. So when Adam and Eve lived in innocence, they moved through the Garden of Eden, they moved through the tree of life effectively in all of its power and its radiance without really understanding. And when they ate of the knowledge without wisdom or understanding, they became conscious of the devastating power that sat within that tree for the first time, and they felt naked and they felt afraid. So the knowledge they gain doesn't reveal their true state, but indeed it separates them from it, because their true state is actually divinity. Divinity sits within everything. So before consciousness there was harmony. Afterwards they have to seek to find this harmony again, but from a different conscious perspective. And they have to find wisdom and understanding in order to do that. And this is the journey of consciousness, a journey that takes us many, many lifetimes to achieve. Now, all existence came from what the Hebrews call the Ein Sof. And this is the unknowable. And the unknowable sits and resides outside the tree of life. It can't be contained by something like the tree. So, but the impulse to know itself, it comes from outside the tree of life. It comes in to the top of the tree of life at Kita and splits into the supernal father and mother, Bina and Chakra. And here we have understanding and wisdom sitting at the top of the tree of life. Now the Zohar, one of the major Kabbalistic books, calls this the mystery of mysteries. And in a pantheistic view of things, we see actually this impulse become a variety of gods and goddesses, numerous gods and goddesses, but it reflects basically the same idea. In fact, you see, it really doesn't matter what source it's coming from, whether it's Hindu, whether it's ancient Egyptian, whether it's Greek. All deities, if you look at their creation myths, all deities go back to a single source, a single divine energy, and then splits out. Now, for the Hebrews, out of nothingness comes one. That's Kitha, the crown. Out of one comes two, Chokmah and Binah. But also out of one comes three, the Trinity. And that's what they call the mystery of mysteries. Out of one comes three. And from the joining of the two comes what Lao Tzu, the Taoist sage, he calls the 10,000 things. On the Tree of Life, we see this represented as the seven Sephiroth, which represent basically the knowledge of all creation. The knowable universe, what's called the knowable universe. So Adam and Eve eat from knowledge without understanding and wisdom. So for knowledge to be truly useful, it requires understanding, and understanding requires wisdom in the way it is used. So, we have a saying, don't we, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and this is knowledge without understanding and wisdom attached to it. So true knowledge is knowledge joined to this understanding and wisdom, not separated from them. And this is what the tree is telling us. It's one of the many, many stories that sits within this tree. It's a very it's a very simple, deceptively simple diagram, and within it are contained really great truths. And Darth knowledge is actually embedded in the tree. It's here, hidden within the tree, there. And as we work our way back up the tree of life, as we work our way back up towards God, we should be revealing Darth. We should actually come to a point where we can see and we reveal Darth in the centre there. Whether I'm anywhere near that or not, I don't know, but we keep going. So, a central axiom of the wisdom teachings was know yourself. And by learning about ourselves and learning about nature, which we're obviously a part of, we all gain a very deep knowledge of ourselves, and that then goes on to give us a deep knowledge and understanding of God. And we need to see the inner truths of what happens, or what our motives are, what our desires are, what our impulses are, and what our real purpose is. Most of the time we're acting from conditioning, we're acting from bias and prejudice and from careless patterns of behaviour and misguided patterns of behaviour. So what this is really saying, and again we see this, Peter pulled it out beautifully in the play, if we could just really know ourselves, really be aware, see the hidden meanings within things, within nature and within ourselves, we would really see the wonder of our true state. We would begin to see, to glimpse our divinity, and it is both uplifting and scary. And the spiritual teacher, Caroline Mace, she says that the single most important lesson we have to learn is how to use our power wisely. And I think the famous quote from Marianne Williamson also captures really beautifully the glory and the terror of this. And she says our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. If we suddenly saw what we really truly are, it would overwhelm us. So it can be seen as a kindness that we have to work little by little in order to accustom ourselves to really what we are and what our true state is. And the tree of life acts as a guide, it acts as a beacon, a path to guide us back to these high levels of consciousness that we came from. Right, now let's get back to our men and their academy. So we've got the king and his 3 nobles, all swearing that they're going to be scholars, they're going to find wisdom, and they're going to scorn the company of women in order to do that. And they're seeking a contemplative rather than an active life, and I think that's quite an interesting sort of mix, because actually the masculine energy is supposed to be the active element rather than the passive element that they're looking for. So they're on a voyage of self-discovery, but they totally lack self-knowledge at this particular point. You know, they really are quite a parody of what they say they're trying to achieve. So there's a real sort of disconnect going on at various levels. There's a desire to retreat, as it were, from the feminine, to retreat from love, and it's an unnatural desire. So they have very nobly stated goals, but they're actually very immature in the way they go about them. And then we have the ladies dropped into the play at this particular point to cause some chaos. So here we have the power of the feminine arriving to seek her mate, exerting its pull in order to seek her mate. So incidentally, I think it's quite interesting to note at this point as well that the Princess of France is arriving as an envoy from her father, and that actually is quite a masculine role. So again, we've got a little bit of a sort of duality going on there. So the result of this balancing factor, if you want, the feminine being introduced into this mix, is that immediately the men are forsworn. Immediately they forswear their oaths, basically. And it's very clear that the ladies know their power and they embrace it. And why shouldn't they? And in doing so, they actually run rings around the men who really they don't really know themselves in the way, you know, that the ladies have a more insight into who they are. The ladies never really mislead themselves in the way that the men do. They both see the men and they see themselves clearly, while at the same time retaining a very strong sense of decorum and propriety. And, you know, patriarchal culture sees women in a very specific way. They want to contain and define the feminine, to contain and define women. They see them as the weaker vessel. And many of the terms that are used, we hear within the play, either reflect this or are slightly derogatory. They talk about wench and female and damsel and child of our mother Eve, with all of the implications that has from a Christian perspective. And they're also identified in terms of property, because Catherine is spoken of as the heir of Aragon and Maria as the heir of Falconbridge. That's how they're identified. And the Princess of France actually never gets a name. She's never named as an individual. The men totally fail to see the essence of the women. They see the outer packaging, as it were, and they see them in terms of property and, worth at that level, but they totally fail to see who the women really are. And it's highlighted by this mask that goes on. They only see the surface, not what lies underneath. They only look with their eyes. They don't look with their heart. And the women know it. And they, they're a bit pissed off with it, and they say, we're not property belonging to the community on which sheep may pasture, a lovely phrase. And the women, as all women do, at least I hope I speak for all women here, they want to be truly seen, not just for their beauty or their net worth, but they want the men to see their true essence. They want to meet a mate at the right level. They know and express as much as they're able to within the society that they live within the true worth of the feminine. So they know this worth. And how, if it's really recognised, that elusive middle pillar of harmony stands a chance of being realised. And by not being easy conquests for the men and accepting the men's shallow valuation of them, they very effectively put the cat amongst the pigeons, withholding themselves and setting the men each a challenge, which really speaks to the individual in order to help to bring the men to a better understanding of themselves, to increase their level of insight and self-knowledge and self-awareness. Because if the men can do this, they become more worthy mates for the women. Barone is the only one who basically has any kind of inkling. We hear it at the beginning because he's the one who protests about there being no ladies in the academy, but gives way. And further on, he has the speech that Peter alluded to, that this quote comes from women's eyes, this doctrine I derive, they sparkle still the right Promethean fire. They are the books, the arts, the academes that show, contain and nourish all the world. And yet, despite this, he still fails to see what is right before him. In seeking truth in a woman's eyes, all he really sees, like all of the other lords, is himself reflected back. So this play echoes a theme that runs through many of Shakespeare's plays, and that is that so many of Shakespeare's sort of heroines really are the higher principle to the male characters. They're both the testers and the initiators, showing the way to a higher level of being. Sort of think of Portia and Hero and Rosalind, even Desdemona. So they often gently point out men's folly and guide them to a better path. And it really can't be understated how unusual this is for the times in which this was written, when women were really viewed as chattels. So, for women, for the feminine to be portrayed in this way, it shows the person who was writing this had a very clear understanding of the part that not just the masculine had to play, but the feminine has to play in bringing harmony into this world. There's no puffing up of one sex over the other, but a genuine desire to show a better way of being, using these dramas to plant the seed. It's taken a long time to flower, but we're getting there. And it also reminds us that the rejection of women, the rejection of the feminine, is not the way of wisdom. In order to create harmony, the divine or golden child, both masculine and feminine, have to be honoured. And I would add to that also that we see now a lot of women trashing men because they are so angry about the millennia of abuse that's gone on before, and that isn't the way of wisdom either. It's about both parties coming together in harmony and in respect for each other. So I'll finish with a quote by Goethe: "The eternal feminine draws us upwards." Thank you. Hopefully a little bit of food for thought.